Hello and welcome back to another episode. Today is a good day. Today it's almost Halloween, one of my favourite times of the year, and of course, as ever, I have a ghost story to share with you. But this year's story isn't really technically a ghost story, and it's also not a story from, as in previous years, for example from North Wales where I grew up. This is a story from much closer to where I live now, in a city called Newcastle in the northeast of England, and it's a story about body snatchers. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we shall begin. Ewan MacDonald was a Highland soldier sentenced to death for murder in the 18th century. Upon mounting the gallows, the poor man's nerve gave way. As the noose was placed around his neck, he lashed out with his feet and knocked the hangman off the scaffold. The executioner was not impressed. He dusted himself down, climbed back up the stairs to the gallows, and with his second attempt to launch Ewan into eternity, was more successful. Or so the hangman thought. Ewan's corpse was taken to the surgeon's hall, the barber surgeons, where a solitary medical student remained on duty. The student occupied himself with some tasks, and then suddenly was alerted by groans where no groans should be. He turned, and to his amazement, the corpse was reviving. Ewan may well have used the old trick of swallowing a tiny silver pipe prior to the noose being put in place in order to preserve his throat. Soon the resurrected man was pleading for his life. The student faced a real dilemma, and he pondered the situation carefully. On the one hand, he had no right to take a life as an aspiring barber surgeon doctor, but on the other hand, to release Ewan would mean relinquishing a precious body for study. Besides which, Ewan was a condemned man. He would only be recaptured and rehung and dissected in another part of the country, thus being lost to the Newcastle students. It was too awful to contemplate. The student made up his mind and responded to Ewan's pleas by smartly bringing his mallet down on Ewan's head, thereby dealing him a fatal blow. The issue was decided. No self-respecting medical man could afford to have a corpse simply get up and walk away from him like that. The student knew no remorse. Rather, he boasted of the incident to his colleagues. He could not have known that Nemesis was at hand. Vengeance was in the air, albeit in the most unexpected form. Shortly afterwards, the apprentice unwisely approached a frisky horse, which struck out at him with its hooves and killed the boy stone dead. Superstitious locals concluded that the beast had been possessed by Ewan's vengeful ghost. A more credible explanation might be that Ewan's colleagues in the army had caught up with the apprentice and carefully, but effectively, bludgeoned him to death. So, the legend of the half-hanged MacDonald was born, and even as early as the 18th century, the barber surgeons had earned themselves an unenviable reputation. It is not therefore surprising that few willingly lingered in the vicinity of the barber surgeons' hall, and if, by the middle of the 19th century, the medical men felt a bit aggrieved at this negative image, it was after all self-inflicted. Prior to 1832, medical science may have been in its infancy, but it was making great strides. This despite the fact that corpses necessary for anatomical instruction were in short supply. Few men were as public-spirited as Cutler, the deformed pie man. John Cutler sold pies to the medical fraternity, and this brought him into contact with the celebrated surgeon John Fife. Fife was fascinated with Cutler's misshapen, malformed body, and he offered the princely sum of £10 in return for the rites of dissection after death. Cutler was happy to oblige and considered this arrangement to be a good business deal. After all, he had made a living out of the medical men, and now he had an opportunity to give something back to the profession. Bodies were always in short supply. It was possible to earn up to 10 guineas by bringing the surgeons a good subject. However, few people followed the example of the mourners at a funeral described in the Newcastle Courant, a newspaper of 1826, on the 28th of January. It seems that the deceased was a miserly man, very cheap with his money, and a small gathering of apathetic relatives and acquaintances gathered at his home prior to the funeral. Few amongst this unenthusiastic little group relished the prospect of having to sit through a long funeral service at St. John's Church, and along the route, one by one, they drifted away from the cortege, making their way to the big market taverns instead. Eventually, only the coffin-bearers were left following the vicar. Realising the situation and determined to make the best of a bad job, they promptly turned around and, still bearing the coffin, made their way to the surgeon's hall, where they sold both coffin and contents for beer money. With the demand for fresh corpses continuing to outstrip supply, it is not surprising that there was a booming corpse trade. This trade, often encouraged by the no-questions-asked attitude of distinguished medical men in receipt of supplies, brought terror and despair to communities in the north of England and in the Scottish lowlands. Parishioners responded to this threat by erecting railings, such as those still to be seen surrounding All Saints' churchyard. How frustrating it must have been for the medical men of Barber Surgeon Hall to witness so many funerals taking place at nearby All Saints' Church, and how tempting it must have been to plan nocturnal forays aimed at unearthing newly deposited corpses to work on. In fact, it was only the proximity of nearby houses and the railings around the church that limited theft from the graveyard. The dreaded resurrection men much preferred to remove corpses from sparsely populated areas such as Elsick and the Ballast Hills. Heavy metal cages called mort safes were frequently placed over fresh graves, and the people of Morpeth even erected a watchtower in their local churchyard to keep an eye out for those who might come stealing the recently deceased. Such precautions were fully justified, and events focusing on the Turf Inn were to conclusively demonstrate just how extensive the operation actually was. The premises of Lloyd's Bank occupy a palazzo-like block on the south side of Collingwood Street. This block replaced the Turf Hotel, which was, in its heyday, one of the most important coaching inns in the north of England, for the Turf was the focal point for daily coaches bound to York and Edinburgh. In religious deference, these services did not run on Sundays, and it was this factor that revealed Newcastle's role in a corpse smuggling trade. The Turf Hotel booking office served as a storage place for all manner of merchandise, awaiting onward carriage, and at busy weekends it was common for packages to miss the designated coach. This happened one Saturday in September 1825, and the following day staff became alarmed by a foul smell emanating from a certain large box. The case in question was addressed to one James Sim, 6 4th Street, Edinburgh. Staff were suspicious enough to summon the police, and the case was gingerly opened in the presence of a magistrate. The case was found to contain the body of a teenage girl. There were no signs of violence, and the coroner recorded a verdict of death by natural causes. The girl's identity was not established, and she was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in St. John's churchyard. This was destined to be only the first of a series of grim discoveries made by the staff of the Turf Inn. In almost identical incidents, no less than 4 bodies were found in cases bound on the Edinburgh coach, and every time things appeared to be returning to normal, yet another corpse would turn up. Working in the turf became a traumatic and deeply disturbing occupation. Meanwhile, the police were puzzled. They were concerned over the provenance of these itinerant corpses. A body discovered on Christmas Day in 1828 was traced back to the internment of a little girl in Whitkirk near York. The child had been buried just the day before on Christmas Eve, and once again the destination was Edinburgh. This time John Smith of 33 York Place, Edinburgh. A second series of corpse discoveries had thus begun, and on Thursday the 8th of January 1829, a man, described as a softly spoken Scotsman, deposited a large box in the booking office of the Queen's Head, Pilgrim Street. Suspicious staff opened the case and found the pathetic corpse of a child. Lizzie Mills, a shoemaker's daughter who had been buried in the Ballast Hills graveyard in Newcastle just a couple of days previously. Policemen rushed to the grave, but when they arrived there was only minimal signs of disturbance. Clearly, the resurrection men were experts in their ghastly trade, and so we will never truly know how many people from Newcastle and the surrounding towns were raised from their eternal sleep, wrapped in as hellish parcels, and then put on the coach bound for Edinburgh. So, not a ghost story, but a good Halloween story, I think you'll agree. And this corpse trade actually was very common. There's a very famous case of some of these resurrection men being caught in and around Edinburgh, because Edinburgh was such a big medical school at the time, making great strides for medicine, but with some less than above board practices, shall we say. Thankfully, that doesn't really happen much today. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that story as much as I enjoyed telling it. And hopefully this has got you in the mood for Halloween. As ever guys, until next time, do take care and have a very happy Halloween. Bye bye.